Hi, Misha here, and as I've done a couple of times already, kind of doing a retrospective fleet overview now that we're at the end of the Eaglemoss collection. We're up to issue 160 something, and we're going to go to 180, but we already know what's going to be the last ones, and it seems like we've gotten all the Romulans we're going to get. Which makes sense, because we pretty much have all the Romulan ship types we've ever seen on screen. So I thought I'd lay them out and just kind of talk about the Romulan fleet. I also put the recently released XL edition of the Warbird back here, although it won't be directly involved in this video. I took it off its stand because it wanted to wobble. It sits fine when it's on a regular shelf, but when it's on a soft, it tends to, yeah. Anywho, kind of always liked the Romulans. It's nice to see evil Vulcans, as it were, basically. And, the first alien race we saw in Star Trek in the original series that went up against the Federation, and there's that untold story of the Romulan War, which I think many people find intriguing, and they were treated a little bit in Enterprise as well. Kind of went dormant for a little bit in the 80s, but then they came back at the end of Season 1 of TNG, and were kind of the main baddies for the first, they're pretty well represented all of TNG, I suppose. Less so in Deep Space Nine, although they were in a few very famous episodes. And they managed to pop up a time or two in Voyager as well. So with that in mind, we'll just kind of talk about the ships. Oh, if I get a cramp in my leg, that is. One of the oddest models we have from Eaglemoss is this one here, the Romulan Marauder from the 4th season multi-parter in Enterprise. Now in reality this model was a reuse of a Voyager model. They just painted it green to be Romulan and added some antenna. In the universe it's referred to as a Warbird, which may be just a generic Romulan term for, well, a warship. And this is the one that was remote controlled, that has triphasic disruptors, no cloak, thankfully. It does have the holographic system. It was intended, the regular ship class we know was intended to be manned, but in that episode these were unmanned. They're very small, only about 35 meters, but they do have basic living quarters and whatnot. Pretty cramped, kind of submarine style interior. And we only see it in that one episode, but we can assume this is one of the more small kind of scout destroyer types used by the Romulans in the 22nd century. And that would be used alongside this craft here, which actually we saw first in the series, but would seem to be the larger companion. This is the 22nd century bird of prey. It is 130 meters, so nearly 100 meters more. Typical bird of prey. We know it has disruptors. It also has a port on the front for some type of torpedo. Although it shouldn't be a plasma torpedo because that's new when they finally encounter it in a 23rd century. Unfortunately, we do see this with a cloak. Some have kind of retconned it, saying it was an experimental failed test bed. Of course, the reality is they just cloaked him because that's, Romulan's cloak, right? But I still, the design fits in well. It is distinctly Romulan, but they didn't just reuse something old. We only see this a couple of times in Enterprise. So this would probably be a frontline craft in the soon-to-happen at that time Earth-Romulan War. And early on, these would not have the bird of prey painted on them. It seems like they started doing that with the Romulan War in the 2150s. Don't really know a lot about this craft because it's just kind of seen here and there, but it does exist. And leads to this craft here, the 23rd century bird of prey. What we see from Star Trek, the original series. This is actually in the 3rd episode they filmed, although I think it was like episode 10 or 12 that actually aired, The Balance of Terror, one of the most famous. And this would actually be the first true alien ship model we saw in Star Trek. As you see, it has the same lines as the early. This one did have the forced plasma torpedo. There's an emitter in the front. It did have an early style cloaking device. It wasn't a complete cloak because they could still kind of detect a shadow on their sensors, but they couldn't really target it. This also would appear in a couple of other episodes in the original series. It would appear in the Deadly Years, and then it would appear in the Enterprise Incident Remastered. But in that episode, they would primarily use the Klingon D7 model. And I talked more about that when I had the kind of individual model for this. I had a video specifically on it. It's about 131 meters. We really don't know the crew, but yeah, we don't really know specs. Some, of course, as I've commented on multiple videos, say that these don't have warp drive. That's ludicrous. I refer you to the thing that apparently some people, JJ, really just don't comprehend how big space is. Without warp drive, this couldn't even get out of the Romulan home system. And the idea that a larger ship would drop these off is just silly and not supported. And it has what are very obviously meant to be warp nacelles on the end. So the whole argument rests on one little line that Scotty says. But the thing is, there's lots of little lines throughout TOS that you just kind of have to ignore. They're either flubs or just kind of things you have to retcon. For example, they refer to the entire galaxy in several episodes as if Starfleet spans the entire thing, which we know by Next Generation they don't. So while TOS is still very enjoyable, you just kind of have to take it with a grain of salt and use your noggin. This would have to have warp. That said, it's probably kind of a scout ship. I mean, it was obviously probing the defenses of the Federation. It is a classic ship. And then that's really all we see from the Romulans until we get to this big boy. The Romulan Warbird. The quintessential Romulan ship, really. This was designed for Next Generation and introduced at the end of Season 1 in the famous We're Back type episode. It's a big, hulking warship. It's between 1,200 and 1,350 meters long, 60 some odd decks, a crew of at least 1,500, which doesn't seem as much as you might expect, but consider that it has this hollow section. Also, that I'm sure lots of room is left over for transports and crew and troops and whatnot. These are at least twice as powerful as a Galaxy class. They have beam disruptors, pulse disruptors. They continue the use of plasma torpedoes. They have a more advanced cloak that is pretty much, at least at the beginning, impenetrable. Since this is such a large ship, that's why I went for getting the XL edition. And I'm glad I did. The only real downsides to the bird of prey are that it is expensive to produce and operate, and that it has a slower max warp and cruise warp than a Federation ship. These can't really get over much over warp 9 without incurring some irreparable damage to the engines. They also are powered by a quantum singularity, a black hole, essentially, which I'm sure has some fun side effects. But But yeah, this is the Romulan ship we see throughout most of the modern, or I should say the 80s, 90s Star Trek. We don't know a whole lot about it, but we know more than others. We do see a few internal shots. This would seem to be the front line ship of the Romulan, or Hansu, if you will, Empire. By the way, this is called the Dideridex Warbird, or the B-type as the Federation labels it. But that wasn't always well suited for all the needs. There was also this class, what is referred to as the Romulan Scout. We see this in Season 3. We first encounter this as a crash ship, and then later as an intact one. This was introduced a short time after the Warbird. The Dideridex seems to be introduced around 2360 or so. This would have been introduced a couple of years later. And this is more of a workaday ship. Kind of the courier, supply runner, patrol ship, you know, kind of the small thing like a Miranda. And it's pretty small. It's about 89 meters. It has only 2 decks. It has a standard crew of between 2 and 6, but it can, in more of a scientific survey role, easily accommodate 15 plus troops. So it has a kind of a flexible cargo area. And it can be operated by one as needed, and it does have a cloaking device. And it's likely that some of these are actually carried on board Warbirds or operate in conjunction with them in a small fleet. But yeah, this is the kind of the eyes and the ears of the fleet, and just a more practical, cheaper, easier to operate version. And it seems like it has about the same max warp as a Warbird, but maybe a little bit slower cruise warp. It still has one main disruptor array and one plasma torpedo launcher. And moving on from it, we have what some consider a variant, others don't. This is the Science ship, first seen in Season 5 of Next Generation. It's certainly based on the Scout, although it's hard to say in universe if it's meant to be or not. We also know from a Voyager episode that a ship like this might have been operated as early as 2350. These are often used for scientific test beds and research. Some say the overall length is 95 meters. Others say it's more like 300. Hard to say. It does have a cloak. It would be multiple decks. Has a crew of at least 100, because we know from that episode of Next Generation that 73 survive, meaning several did perish. But yeah, it's a kit bash of the Scout, but it's nice to see them reusing it, and they do kind of a lineage with it. And this would be kind of their O-berth maybe, or what have you, but moving along, we have the actual last practical model made, the Romulan shuttle, which is a bit of a misnomer. This is more like a runabout. It's 24 meters, so pretty big. Has a standard crew of 2 to operate it, and it can carry up to 3 passengers comfortably, or probably a dozen troops, because they're troops, and who cares how comfortable they are. It does have a cloak. It actually has a very good warp. Its max warp is about 9.6. It's intended to get places quickly, and it can cruise at warp 7 very conveniently. It has as many as 6 disruptor cannon, as well as 2 micro plasma torpedo arrays, or launchers I should say. So this wasn't only used to transport diplomats like Vreenak, but also as an assault ship. And this would be, we see this in use during the Dominion War era. And it obviously has quite a long range because it visits Deep Space Nine, and the Romulans are quite a ways from home then. So it seems like it can operate quite independently and even do a respectable job of defending itself. This is the only new Romulan model we get thanks to Deep Space Nine. Mostly when they're in the Dominion War, we see them using Warbirds, the Daradex classes. It's kind of interesting that they didn't use the Scout type a bit more. Would kind of seemed logical for being cannon fodder, but oh well. And then our final ship here is from the movie Nemesis, the Valdor type, perhaps Valdor class. This is a redesign for that movie. Very large, but very flat. It definitely shows Romulans having learned lessons from the Dominion Wars. It's only about 600 meters long front to back, but it does have a wingspan of 900 meters. It is smaller than the Daradex, but also has probably more weaponry, at least forward-facing. Torpedoes and plasma and disruptors and all that good stuff. Of course, it has a cloak. We don't know the crew, but roughly 800 to 1,000 probably, because it is still a big ship. It was faster and easier to mass produce than the Daradex. Easier to operate, a little more versatile in that sense, but also it did sacrifice a few things as far as like cargo troop carrying abilities and, you know, maybe overall defensive systems, although its offensive systems seem quite good. It's still very distinctly Romulan, although it is a kind of a more of a Klingon nod than before, but this is the first major Romulan warship that we've seen since the Warbird, believe it or not. So it was definitely time they got a cutting-edge ship. This was introduced probably in the 2370s. We know they were in service by the 2378, the time of Nemesis, and it seems like by the 2380s these were replacing the Daradex in most Romulan squadrons. We also see a brown variant in the movie, but that's probably just lighting, and you know, the real world reason would be just to let you know there are two ships. But yeah. Yeah, there's not a whole lot to be said about Romulan ships because they've been kept mysterious, which is fun considering how long they have been in Star Trek, but that's alright. So what about, as I've been doing, where I would kind of rank these models, die-cast models from Eaglemoss. Alright, so I've got 8 of them here. We won't count the XL one. And just because I say one's higher on the list or lower doesn't necessarily mean I don't like it. It just means that that's where it's at. So, what will be my number 8? That's pretty easy. I'm going to have to go, and I'm sure a lot would kind of agree this time, on the Marauder. While the model is well executed from Eaglemoss, especially considering how much is going on with antenna and stuff, it's just not very Romulan. And that shows. Again, not a bad model, but it's just not very Romulan. It would have been nice if they had kind of done something more unique, but it was the end, I get it. So yeah, that'll have to be number 8. Now again, just kind of how it is. As for number 7, gonna have to go with the science ship. Again, not because it's a bad model. I mean, it's nice that someone did a science ship. You don't see many physical models of these, but like, it does have more plastic. This whole rear section they added on is plastic. And the head. So not a bad one, but not a especially eye-catching one. But it's nice to have it to, you know, give us a complete fleet. Because we really do. We have a very complete fleet. Complete fleet. As for number 6, I'm going to go with the Warbird. Not because it's a bad model. Actually, I think they did a good job considering how big it is. But it's just so hard to render such a massive ship in such a small scale. And to be fair, the early ones, they had trouble with the stands. They revised the stand later. The bottom is plastic, but the top part's metal. I think I'd give it a little higher ranking if it were more all metal. And also, you know, I have this because it was early in the collection, but also I knew what it looked like, so there wasn't a great mystery. It was one of those things more just to have a complete collection, but there have been tons of models and whatnot of the Warbird, so I kind of like the ones that let me see what something looks like for the first time, if that makes sense. Kind of in a similar vein, the TOS Bird of Prey can be in my number 5. I think they did a quite good job with this. It feels good. It's got a lot of metal content. It's actually a pretty good size considering how relatively small it was in the show. But it's also a relatively plain model because it's from TOS and because I knew what this looked like before. There were a few models already out there from the 80s and 90s. But I think they did a very good job. Number 4, I'm going to go with the Scout ship. I'm really glad they did this. I think this is an often overlooked ship. It does have decent metal content in kind of the wing portion, but the head is still kind of more plasticky than I might have preferred. And while it's a good looking model, it does kind of harken back to the Bird of Prey in my mind. It seems like this is kind of what the Bird of Prey class evolved into, but that's my own headcanon. It is a little on the plain side, and unfortunately it wasn't in more episodes, so kind of wish it had been. But oh well. Number 3, I'm going to go with, surprisingly, the shuttle here. And the reason I say that, this wasn't one that I was really excited to get in the beginning. I mean, I was kind of focusing on more on full-fledged ships, not shuttles at the time. But they did an excellent job with this model. It has a good bit of metal content. It's chunky, it's detailed, it's distinctly Romulan, and it's something very unique. I don't know that anyone else has ever done a model of this. If they have, it's only been once or twice. And my number 2 is basically tied with my number 1, to be honest with you. The Enterprise era Bird of Prey. I just really like this design, and while I did know it was similar in my head to the original series one, I really didn't know exactly what it looked like until this collection. And I think they did an excellent job of kind of updating the design, making it look different but same. It looks aggressive but still very Romulan, and the model itself is just solid feeling, got a lot of detail. The whole the center part is metal, top and bottom. Of course, the nacelles are plastic. They just did a great job, in my opinion, on this, and this is one I was really excited to get. This is definitely ones that inspired me to start buying the Eaglemoss ships, and I'll probably do a video on that one day, kind of talking about the ships that got me into this, and this is one of them. And likewise, number 1, the Valdor. Another one I didn't really know what it looked like. I think considering how bizarre shape this is, I think they did an excellent job. It doesn't have a high metal content, but they did the best. I mean, it's just such a thin design. They often had to use plastic to get the size right, but even though it's so light, it's still a good size, and it sits on its stand well. It's well detailed for the small scale. And there just aren't many Valdor type models out there. And say what you will about Nemesis, I thought the battle with the Enterprise on the side of this ship, the Valdor, in the aftermath was a good Star Trek moment. The whole thing. So I liked the part it played in the movie, and I just thought it was nice that they finally gave the Romulans a new warship after so many years. So definitely another one that inspired me to get into the Eaglemoss collection, and I'm not disappointed by it. But in general, I like Romulan ships. I like their aesthetic. I like them as a villain, frenemy. They're not just one note. They actually have some dimension to them as a race. They're not just, even from the very first episode in TOS, they're given a certain sense of nobility, and yeah. I'd like to know more about Romulans, but then again, the mystery is kind of part of the charm. So yeah, that's my ranking of the Romulan fleet from Eaglemoss. Love to hear what you think below, and if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time.